In the spring of 146 BCE, the Roman Republic dealt the final killing blow to their longtime rivals, the Carthaginians. After over a century of on-and-off warfare between the two Mediterranean empires, which culminated in a 3-year siege of Carthage, the Romans finally came out on top and conquered the historic city. There's a popular story that after they achieved this victory, the Romans salted the fields around Carthage to make it so the area would never sustain life ever again. The story isn't true. The Romans themselves ended up rebuilding Carthage a few centuries later, but it speaks to how brutally thorough the destruction of Carthage was. The Romans enslaved every inhabitant who wasn't killed and then burned the city to the ground. They found Carthage as the sprawling metropolitan center of a vast Mediterranean empire and left it an empty, isolated, uninhabited pasture. Try for a second to imagine what the Roman consul Scipio Africanus the Younger was thinking as he gazed upon the burning ruins of Carthage. What do you think he felt? Anger? Relief? Maybe euphoria? We don't know what this guy was into. Maybe lust? Well, lucky for us, we don't have to guess. You see, Scipio, like most middle-aged oligarchs, had a tutor who he brought everywhere with him, even on campaign, and, as luck would have it, this tutor, Polybius, would turn out to be one of the most famous historians of ancient history. So thanks to Polybius's account, we know exactly how Scipio reacted. He wept. And then, after a while of crying, he turned to Polybius and spoke. Quoting from the Iliad, he said, "A day will come when sacred Troy shall perish, and Priam and all his people shall be slain." Scipio had succeeded in finally and definitively destroying the enemy that had threatened Rome's safety and dominance for a century. The enemy that not only his civilization, but also his family had spent generations in an existential struggle with. And as he watched the city burn, he thought about the inevitability of death and decay. The city, which had once been the capital of an unparalleled power in the Western Mediterranean, a city older than Rome itself, was now nothing more than a smoldering pile of rubble. Through his own actions, Scipio had proved that everything, even a city as ancient and dominant as Carthage, is destined to end. His empire, that of the Romans, was destined to share the same fate. Eventually everything, men, cities, and even the most powerful empires, will be swept away by the sands of time. The year is 1969. The massive wave of student protests against the Vietnam War has prompted the governor of California to deliver a speech at Eisenhower College. During the speech, the governor of California, Ronald Reagan, draws a parallel between Rome and the United States. We know it started with a kind of pioneer heritage, not unlike our own. Then it entered its 2 centuries of greatness, reaching its height in the second of those 2 centuries, going into its decline and collapse in the third. However, the signs of decay were becoming apparent in the latter years of that 2nd century. Reagan is trying here, rather clumsily, to jam the square peg of America into Rome's round hole. This sentence encapsulates the entirety of Roman history until the founding of the empire, 800 years of history. This sentence, well, we'll get there, but first let's let AI Reagan finish his speech. Sorry, AI Reagan couldn't make it. He's busy doing whatever AI Reagan would do. Ignoring the AI AIDS crisis or something. We are approaching the end of our 2nd century. It has been pointed out that the days of democracy are numbered once the belly takes command of the head, when the less affluent feel the urge to break a commandment and begin to covet that which their more affluent neighbor possess, and they are tempted to use their votes to attain instant satisfaction. Reagan is making another error here, misattributing events from the end of the Republic to being about the fall of the Empire. At the end of their 2nd century, which means the 2nd century of the Pax Romana, the Roman Empire was not a democracy or a republic. It had an emperor. I'm not just a weird nerd making fun of somebody for slightly messing up a detail whilst tangentially mentioning my special interest, though. Reagan's doing something here, and like almost everything he did, it's pretty insidious. He's using the fall of the Roman Empire, a historical event that he can't even date to the right century, as a weapon. A weapon against welfare, as we've already seen, but the speech doesn't end there. Soon Reagan is rallying against the problems with campus protests and employees stealing from their workplaces.
Yeah, another day, another box of stolen pens.
And during all this, a question is begged but never asked. Will these things cause the fall of our civilization, just like Rome? If students protest against imperialism or somebody takes home a pencil from work, is Western civilization doomed to collapse just like Rome before it? Scipio seems to have been vindicated in having his little existential breakdown, because now it's his own civilization whose collapse gets people all hysterical. And for good reason. More so than Carthage ever was, the Roman Empire was a colossal superpower, a completely unrivaled hegemonic force in the Mediterranean for centuries. And yet, just like Carthage, it's gone. So naturally, the fall of Rome has taken on an incredibly powerful symbolic position in our culture. People examine the collapse, or some jumbled character of it, and try to draw conclusions and predictions for the modern world, or, as Reagan no doubt gave away, more often, rather than evidence about the past informing predictions of the future, it's interpretations of the past that are molded in order to reinforce contemporary political views. And since the history we're talking about is the fall of an empire as prolific and revered as Rome, that inevitably involves a lot of fear-mongering. This goes far beyond just Reagan, though. Reagan can't even bring up the topic without acknowledging how cliché it was to compare the fall of the Roman Empire to contemporary American politics. And let me remind you that this speech was delivered in 1969. It was already cliché half a century ago, and it absolutely did not stop there. Here's a pretty wild example of this phenomenon. In 1984, actress Joan Collins, known for her famous role in the show Dynasty, did an interview with Playboy magazine. Joan Collins attacked what she saw as the libertine culture of the early 1980s by claiming that AIDS appeared to teach us all a lesson. It's just like the Roman Empire, she said. Wasn't everyone just covered in syphilis, and then it was destroyed by volcanoes? Reagan isn't even the only example of this rhetoric being used by US presidents. Here's 37th President Richard Nixon in yet another conversation he probably regrets recording, talking about the sitcom All in the Family.
The point that I make is that, goddamn, I do not think that you glorify on public television homosexuality. You ever see what happened? You know what happened to the Greeks? Homosexuality destroyed them. Sure, Aristotle was a homo. We all know that. But with Socrates,
He never had the influence of television.
the last 6 Roman emperors were fags. You see, homosexuality, immorality generally, these are the enemies of strong societies. That's why the communists and the left-wingers are pushing each other. They're trying to destroy us.
Nowadays, the opportunistic rhetorical use of the fall of Rome is usually done in an effort to attack immigrants. Boris Johnson did that at a G20 summit in Rome back in 2021, apparently. So, we just got a lot of conflicting information about the fall of Rome. We learned that the fall of Rome was caused by either welfare, God's homophobic wrath, or immigration. The truth is that the fall of Rome has become something of a trope used by reactionaries to fearmonger about basically whatever they don't like. They can blame whatever they want for causing the fall of Rome, because most people have no idea why it actually happened, including me for the longest time. In my experience, the fall of the Roman Empire is an area of particular historical ignorance for lay people. For most of my life, even as somebody who's been interested in history for a long time, I've never known much about the fall of Rome other than a vague sense that it happened, and maybe the word barbarian. So, who better than me to set the record straight? So I did a ton of reading, and dear God, it's so much more complicated than this. Why don't we start with the seemingly simple question of when this happened? After all, I criticized Reagan for saying the Roman Empire had its decline and collapse in the 3rd century. This is a good place to start, but as will become clear as we discuss the history, Reagan's theory is shit. Let's all take a moment to laugh at him. Alright, stop. When did the Roman Empire fall? As it turns out, there are several common answers to this question, so let's go ahead and start with the most common one. If you Google, when did the Roman Empire fall, it's going to tell you 476 CE. So what happened that year? Well, In 476, the Western Roman Emperor was deposed by Odoacer, this German guy who convinced a bunch of other German soldiers allied with Rome to help him stage a coup. They succeed and send the Emperor, Romulus Augustus, into exile in Campania, which is somewhere. I don't really know. I'll look it up before editing. So, that seems pretty significant, right? The Roman Emperor was forcibly removed from power. Maybe there's some truth to this date. I mean, that doesn't happen every day. Actually, no, it kind of did happen every day. This was in fact the fate of the majority of Roman emperors, couped and replaced. But this wasn't just any other run-of-the-mill, everyday Roman coup. This one was different, which was made clear when Odoacer made one crucial decision. He sent all the special ceremonial emperor stuff back to the Eastern Emperor in Constantinople. The crown, the scepter, the hemophilia, all the things royals are supposed to have to signal their royalness, he sent back. To go along with this, Odoacer refused to name a new Roman emperor, making Romulus Augustus the last one. Instead of being Emperor of Rome, Odoacer deemed himself the King of Italy. So, 476 seems like a pretty reasonable answer to our question. But it isn't the only answer. The second theory for when Rome fell dates the final collapse at 480 CE, the year a man named Julius Nepos died. Once upon a time, Julius Nepos was the Western Roman Emperor. Everything was going great for him except for one thing. He had an open position in his number 2 spot in government, the Magister Militum. This was a very important decision for Nepos because the Magister Militum was the head of the army, the master of soldiers. Thankfully, one day Julius met a fine German general named Orestes, who had an incredible resume, even having fought with Attila at one point. He'll come up later. So, Nepos makes Orestes the Magister Militum, and this goes for him exactly as bad as you'd expect. Since being the Magister Militum put Orestes in charge of basically all Roman military power, he almost immediately couped Nepos and forced him to flee to Dalmatia, which is here. Ha, I knew that one. Orestes then installed his son, Romulus Augustus, as his puppet on the throne and continued on as Magister Militum. This all went down in 475, 1 year before Odoacer would pull the same stunt on Orestes and Romulus. Nepos lived in Dalmatia until he died in 480, and neither him nor the Eastern Emperor Zeno ever recognized Romulus Augustus as the legitimate emperor. So there you go. On the one hand, the empire is considered collapsed when the title of emperor disappears in 476, but Nepos was the emperor all the way until 480, just not in Rome. Our third example of a possible collapse date is 1453. This answer is sort of cheating, but I think it's necessary to explain anyway. When we talk about the Roman Empire falling in 476 or 480, we're talking about the western half of the Roman Empire, because the whole thing had already been split in two. To explain this super briefly, in the 3rd century, the whole Roman Empire basically fell apart and ceased to function for about 50 years. In their pre-modern world, without efficient communication technology, where power stemmed directly from controlling the loyalty of groups of guys carrying pointy sticks, it became very difficult for any one individual to wield said power over a territory as absurdly large as the Roman Empire. Imagine for a moment that you yourself are the Roman Emperor. You're sitting around in central Italy, twiddling your thumbs, plotting matricide 1,000 kilometers from the frontier. Suddenly, the empire is under attack from the Persians or Parthians or Sassanids or whatever they're calling themselves nowadays. What do? Administrating a war happening in Syria from Italy in the 3rd century was not possible. I mean, think about it. The Romans didn't have phones. They didn't have faxes. If you wanted to send a message to your governor in Syria, you literally had to hand it to some guy and tell him to go walk there. Okay, maybe that guy would get on a boat or a horse, but you get the idea. It was an incredibly slow process. You'd send a letter saying, send 50,000 troops east to halt the Parthian advance, and then you'll get a response back saying, truce, because your message had a typo, and it'll have taken 6 months to get there because 3 of the messengers were butchered en route. Then you'll get an unrelated message informing you that the Parthians have conquered Syria. The empire was simply too big for this to be a viable option, and so the only 2 choices the Roman emperors were left with both kinda sucked. One option was for you to travel out east and assume command yourself. But this option shouldn't be taken lightly. You'd be leaving behind the cushy palace life of Rome for a hard and potentially dangerous one in the battlefield. One emperor who chose this path, Valerian, was captured in battle and, according to one account, was turned into Persian King Shapur I's footstool. But even if you choose this option, you have to once again take into account the distance from Rome to the Roman borders. If the military is just sitting around waiting for you to cross the entire Roman Empire before they start their campaign, you're going to be giving the enemy a huge head start. Thus, the trend was for emperors to increasingly take the second option, which was to delegate command to various generals. If you're thinking this sounds a bit like what Julius Nepos did with Orestes, then you're exactly right, and it had the exact same effect. In the 3rd century, conflicts along the Roman borders in Eastern Europe and the Middle East caused lots of ambitious generals to aspire to use the loyalty of their troops to replace the emperor, and they spent like 50 years civil warring each other over the privilege. That was a very simplified summary of the crisis, but I'm mostly just trying to get one thing across here. The empire's too big. They can alleviate some of this problem by delegating power, but that inevitably leads to internal conflict. Anyways, after the crisis wraps up, they try to deal with this issue by splitting up power between emperors centered in different areas, and the empire is only ever reunited under a single ruler again when one of those regional emperors, most notably Constantine, defeats the others in civil war. The last emperor of a united Roman Empire was Theodosius I. When he died in 395, he split the empire between his sons Arcadius and Honorius, and the two halves of the empire were never reunited again. Or were they? Who said that? I'm you like 5 minutes from now. I came back in time to spoil things. Historians refer to the eastern half of the Roman Empire after this 395 split as the Byzantine Empire. It's important to keep in mind, though, that everybody at the time knew it as the Roman Empire, and historians simply decided to name it after the old name for Constantinople afterwards to make it easier. And they're right, it is easier, so I'll be saying Byzantine from now on too. But just remember that this is Roman. This Byzantine Empire lasted all the way until 1453 when the Ottomans conquered Constantinople. It's another fairly reasonable answer to the question. After 395, it seems like everybody forgets about the Byzantine half of the empire and only focuses on the West's death. Meanwhile, these Greeks were slugging it out for 1,000 more years. This is an interesting answer, but it's also kind of cheating, obviously. After all, if we accept this answer, we're still left with the question of when the West fell. But could it just be one of the two options I went over already? I mean, I didn't have any problems with them. Come to think of it, I didn't raise any problems with 1453 either. Is that a good enough date? My first problem with the 476 date comes from a common mischaracterization of Odoacer's actions. He didn't return the royal hemophilia to Constantinople because he had toppled the Roman Empire. He returned it because he had reunited the empire. When he deposed the usurper, Romulus Augustus, Odoacer presented himself as a client king to the now sole emperor in Constantinople. Now, it could certainly be argued that this was simply a cynical way to legitimize Odoacer's new regime, which would remain outside of Byzantium's control in practice. But, as I mentioned before, the emperor Odoacer deposed, Romulus Augustus, was himself considered illegitimate by the Byzantines. So, Odoacer's coup put Italy back in the hands of someone who had the support of and a legitimate connection to the Roman Empire. Or so he presumably thought it would. This plan ended up going horribly for Odoacer. The Byzantine Emperor Zeno refused his proposal and demanded he reinstate Julius Nepos. When Odoacer didn't, Zeno went behind his back to these barbarians to the north called the Ostrogoths, promising them control of Italy if they got rid of Odoacer. They warred for a bit back and forth, and then, when they went to have a banquet for their peace treaty, the Ostrogothic king Theodoric red-weddinged Odoacer. Theodoric then consolidated his power on the peninsula, and thus we got a Byzantine client king in Italy in a sort of roundabout fashion. For that reason, in 497, the Byzantine court sent all the special imperial regalia back to Italy anyway, so big whoop. Another problem with 476 is that it seems to be putting a ton of stake in the existence of a Roman emperor, even though the office really wasn't that important by the 5th century. Remember how I mentioned that Romulus Augustus was just a puppet of his father, the Magister Militum? Yeah, well, by that point, they pretty much all were. Remember, power doesn't flow from laws or from titles. It flows from groups of men carrying pointy sticks. And at this point, those groups of men were not controlled by the emperor anymore. Odoacer simply happened to be the person to finally put the institution out of its misery. He could have got a little prop emperor to do whatever he said like his predecessors had, but thankfully he had the decency to finally end the whole charade and abolish the title. But I mean, what's in a title? The British monarchy right now has a roughly similar amount of power as the emperors did by the end, and I don't think anybody's gonna claim Britain doesn't exist anymore when they finally abolish that archaic institution. The totality of what went down in 476 CE is that a defunct title was abolished as the result of a coup, and Rome is famous for coups. There is Rome in his slavery. Moving on. So, the problems with this date are pretty obvious, I think. For one thing, they base the existence of a Roman Empire on the existence of a Roman emperor, same as the last one. But also, I don't care what Zeno or this one guy in my comment section says, you aren't the Roman emperor if you're just some dude hiding away in Dalmatia shaking in your boots. We can all see that that's silly, right? Next. So, yes, this is sort of a cop-out, but maybe it's the real answer. The question of the Byzantines' Romanness, Romanity, is more complicated than I made it seem earlier. I mean, historians aren't idiots, usually. They stopped calling these guys Romans for a reason, and that reason comes down to culture. The eastern and western halves of the empire were very culturally distinct. The Latinized West contrasted heavily against the eastern half, which was still dominated by the Hellenic Greek culture. The East spoke Greek, the West spoke Latin, and there would eventually be a harsh divide between the churches centered in Rome and in Constantinople. And I mean, think about it. Can any empire that doesn't contain the city of Rome really be the Roman Empire? What we're left with here is a question about what defines Romanness. Is Romanity about controlling the city of Rome? Or is it about a shared culture or language? Or is it about state continuity and dynastic succession? If Romanity is about Roman culture, then the Byzantines can't really be said to be Roman. They were Greek. On the other hand, if it's about descent and a connection to dynastic history, that just seems sort of arbitrary to me. After all, there wasn't actually a consistent line of dynastic succession that you can point to in the Roman Empire, because, as I'm sure you're sick of hearing about by now, the Romans' favorite pastime was killing their own emperors. So really, this continuity with the Rome of Augustus or even Constantine is mostly an illusion anyway, even before the empire was divided. And even if the Byzantines could claim a connection to some imaginary perfectly Roman dynasty, I'm still not totally buying it. Like, why are you, the guy who speaks Greek and lives in Anatolia, an area occupied by an empire that does not control the city of Rome, calling yourself a Roman? I know you said it, and maybe I should take your word for it, but I don't know. I'm definitely questioning it a little bit. On the other hand, if we define the empire based on culture, then I guess the East was never part of the Roman Empire, since there was no widespread assimilation of the East. I'll go ahead and wrap this part of the video up now and just tell you exactly how I feel about the issue, so I can get back to my favorite pastime as a Roman history enjoyer, ignoring the Byzantines. Romanness, in this case, is just a name. It's pointless to debate whether or not the Byzantine Empire is Roman, because it just kinda is. In some ways it is, in some ways it isn't. Who cares? It's both. Romanness for a person or for an empire is really more of a self-identification than a fact. So, I just gave you 3 options and then spent 5 minutes saying why they're all stupid. You probably want to hear my real answer now. When did the Roman Empire fall? It didn't. There's this ancient Greek thought experiment known as the Ship of Theseus, and it goes something like this. The Athenians have this boat that the city's mythical founder Theseus used to rescue the children of Athens from Crete in prehistoric Troy times. So, in philosophy times, to celebrate this legendary crossing, they take the boat out on one specific day every year and sail it around a little bit. But here's the problem. This ceremonial usage of the boat causes wear and tear, and so every once in a while they have to repair the Ship of Theseus. They take off its various boards and components and fix or replace them entirely. Eventually, in the decades and probably centuries that they were doing these repairs, they necessarily became so numerous that every single original piece of Theseus's ship had surely been removed and replaced. And since this was philosophy times, they couldn't help themselves. They had to ask the question, is it still the same boat? And if not, when did it become a different one? Was it the moment the last piece was replaced? Or maybe the first? Or maybe it becomes a new ship once more than half of it has been replaced? Think about it for a minute. Okay, that's enough thinking. Back to me. For me at least, all of these answers feel like they're missing the point. There is no one time you can point to when the ship becomes a new one. The ship of Theseus was undergoing a slow process of transformation. Sort of like all things, all the time. You too are a ship that replaces every part of itself because of wear and tear and aging and whatever else. Every some amount of years, all your cells are going to die and be replaced. I don't know, one of these articles could probably tell you how many. So, you old fuck, does the fact that all your boards have been thrown out and replaced make you a new ship? My perspective is that the ship of Theseus's value as a thought experiment comes from its ability to demonstrate the profound difficulty of attempting to explain change over time with precise and simple language. We represent this thing in front of us using a series of words, the ship of Theseus. But of course, the ship of Theseus is itself an immensely complex piece of machinery, with hundreds of component parts all carefully assembled, each made of billions of constantly moving particles. When some of this thing we've deemed the ship of Theseus gets changed, we call it the same ship, but when all of it does, some hoity-toity philosopher guy says it's different. It's all rather arbitrary. So, I know I may have sounded a bit crazy when I said the Roman Empire didn't fall. I mean, this was the Roman Empire. But if you look at this area on a modern map, you'll notice that it's covered in other names, none of which say Roman Empire. And worst of all, it's got all these gross lines dividing it up. Obviously something happened in late antiquity, so what exactly am I talking about? Well, I feel like I've danced around it enough at this point, so I'll just lay my thesis out for you, nice and clear. The fall of the Roman Empire is not an event that happened. This is why it's so difficult to find a precise year. Rather, it's a framework that historians have constructed to understand the events of late antiquity. As you can probably tell, I don't like this framework. I think it vastly oversimplifies a complicated historical process, and in so doing opens the door for the fall of Rome's famously useful place in reactionary fear-mongering. Nowadays, historians are much more likely to acknowledge the complexity of the issue. These historians refer to this period by the name Late Antiquity, which means that instead of this time in the 5th and 6th centuries being the stark end of antiquity and beginning of the Dark Ages, it's all one continuous and complicated era, known as Late Antiquity. Well, I like to think of the Roman Empire as a ship of Theseus. Since its very inception, it's been changing. The boards of Rome's ships were replaced all the time, and for millennia, historians have been arguing about at which point they replaced too many and the boat became something else entirely. But as I'll argue in this video, it's far more accurate and useful to understand the process of change, how and why those boards were replaced, than to pick a specific point at which the Roman ship ceases to exist and becomes medieval. As you'll see throughout this video, there were things we'd associate with medieval Europe developing and even present long before 476, and what was to me a shocking amount of Roman institutions and systems existing long after that date too. For the rest of this video, I will be explaining these changes and similarities in some depth, along with continuing to unravel the 476 date. I've attempted to write this video so that anybody can understand, regardless of how much they know about the topic, while hopefully going in depth enough to not bore those who know a lot about it. I'm no expert, just somebody with too much time on their hands and a YouTube channel, but I've read a lot of the experts, and I'm going to try to be as diligent as possible with my footnoting to alleviate that little shortcoming. Typing all that crap on screen every time and trying to make it look good is way more trouble than it's worth though. So, if you ever want to know where I got any of the information, just look at one of these numbers on screen for the footnote in the description or a pinned comment. There were a lot of complicated factors responsible for causing the changes of late antiquity, and I'm going to spend the rest of this video going over an admittedly incomplete list of them. And since the previous section probably made it clear how much this whole story revolves around them, let's start with the barbarians. Okay, so one question you might be asking is, what exactly is a barbarian? Are they just sort of bloodthirsty savages? Well, that's certainly the intended connotation. Barbarian was the term that the holier-than-thou Romans used to describe groups of people that they felt were beneath them. It's a negative, xenophobic term, but the Romans were still right to make the distinction. Barbarian societies were markedly different from Roman society. The Romans had a full-fledged empire with a state, class division, patriarchy, and large permanent cities. The barbarians, on the other hand, were still each at various stages in the development of those things. In the distant past, these groups, as well as the Romans and everyone else, lived in egalitarian societies without classes, states, or wealth of any kind, really. Barbarians were groups of people who existed in between these two stages. Imagine prehistoric egalitarianism as childhood, and ancient empires like Rome as adulthood. The barbarians are going through puberty.
Can I help you, sir?
My God, you're greasy.
I'll be calling these pizza-faced freaks barbarians sometimes throughout the video, but don't take that as an implicit agreement that their society was worse than that of the Romans for whatever reason. Honestly, I struggle to imagine a society that would be. The real reason I'm saying it is just because I felt like a tool saying Germanic peoples 3 times a sentence. Okay, so these barbarians are going through puberty, but they're not all at the same part of it. Some were late bloomers. For the most part, though, by late antiquity, they were all nearer the end than the beginning. This was the result of centuries of contact with the vast wealth of the Roman Empire, accelerating their growth, like whatever the opposite of puberty blockers are. They did so by trading, raiding, and becoming allies that the Romans called federates, or federati. This wealth accelerated the development of class society because it got unevenly distributed, which helped to further develop an intense polarization of wealth, and because it incentivized barbarians to fight each other for their newfound riches, which had the same effect. So, now that we kinda understand what the barbarians were like, let's get into how they became an important force in Roman society, starting with the military, since that's where power rested. For the most part, barbarians started to enter the Roman military due to a crisis in military recruitment. This crisis came largely as a result of military service losing the 2 main advantages it had enjoyed throughout Roman history. First of all, military service had traditionally been a pathway towards citizenship for Roman subjects living outside of Italy, but in 212 all free men in the empire were given full citizenship from the Edict of Caracalla. The other reason to join the army was to get rich quick by killing and or enslaving people and stealing their stuff, but that wasn't really an option anymore either. Rome had already conquered all the people and goods that were ripe for looting. Now, Rome's 2 main frontiers bordered A bunch of barbarians without much of value to steal, and B, the Persians, who would just end up making you a footstool. By this point, the army was used primarily for defense, which wasn't profitable, and thus nobody wanted to join. Couldn't the Roman state just conscript people, you're thinking? Well, they tried, but it was made difficult by the Roman patronage system. Patronage is a pretty common and simple pre-modern social phenomenon. It's basically a system of social norms that developed in which a high-class patron will offer a lower-class client material advantages in exchange for prestige and to pass on a kind of social debt to the client. It's a mutually beneficial relationship between 2 people of vastly different rank. I pay you money for nothing more than the privilege of having you be in my debt, a debt you'll never be able to repay with money. Rome's richest citizens would be patrons with massive retinues of clients who were obliged through familial connections and that social debt to politically support and in general just kiss up to their patrons. This was a vast and intricate system which played a huge role in the social fabric of Roman society. I'll be back to this point later, but for now it's just important to say that patrons in the late empire worsened the crisis of military recruitment by using their wealth to shield their clients from conscription. To remedy this problem, the Romans decided to start mass recruiting their barbarian federates into the military. This had a number of important effects. For one thing, the barbarian soldiers, generals, and chiefs who joined Roman units returned to their increasingly hierarchical tribes with new knowledge from the Romans about how to be more Roman and how to be civilized. So, here we are. On the one hand, we have Rome and everything that entails, culturally and politically and economically. And on the other hand, we have the Germanic barbarians. These 2 forces are being slowly smushed together, and their synthesis will shock you. The Roman army these barbarians were joining was one which had recently undergone major reforms. Most important for us is that it had to reorganize itself along meritocratic lines during the 3rd century crisis. This meant that the highest positions were no longer based on lineage, but instead effectiveness and probably some internal politics. Either way, in these conditions, German federates and the legions could rise through the ranks. This influx of barbarians into high ranks of the military meant that a lot of the powerful generals who controlled all the pointy stick-carrying men by the time the empire split in two were German. These barbarian generals, who usually held the position of Magister Militum, seem to have been somewhat self-conscious about their status as barbarians, because they refused to usurp the title of emperor for themselves directly. Instead, as we've already seen with Orestes, they would appoint a sympathetic and usually weak Roman aristocrat to take up the position for them, while they held all the real military and therefore political power. In doing so, powerful generals like Arbogast, Stilicho, Ricimer, Gundobad, and Orestes transformed the legendary position of Roman emperor in the West into a mere puppet of the Magister Militum. Of course, the barbarians didn't just infiltrate the military and by extension the state. They also migrated en masse into the Roman borders. This event is known as the Volkerwanderung. Beginning in the middle of the 4th century, this migration period was primarily caused by one man actually, Attila. Who's Attila? Attila's Hun. You might even call him the Hun. The Huns are these nomads in the Eurasian steppe. Instead of building societies around agriculture like, say, the Romans or the barbarians did, the Huns were pastoralists, so their economy revolved around herding animals and moving along with the flock. As you can probably guess, this made them incredibly proficient at horseback riding, and thus terrifying to the Romans and barbarians. Think of them as like 4th century Mongols. One day they were like, hey, why don't we conquer Earth? And so they tried, and got closer than almost anybody else had to up to that point. As the Huns pushed east into Europe, they sent a flood of barbarian refugees hurtling towards the Roman borders. The first of these barbarians to arrive at the Roman borders were the Goths in 376, and it was very chaotic. So chaotic that they actually split up into two distinct political units altogether. Half of them made a deal with the Eastern Emperor Valens, who agreed to let them live in the Balkans in exchange for military service to help alleviate the recruitment crisis. These Goths are known from this point forward as the Visigoths, whereas the other ones who were still milling around the Danube River at this point are now Ostrogoths. It is important to note that this was not immigration in the modern sense. The Visigoths settled the Balkans as Roman federati, not as aspiring Roman citizens. They continued to be governed by Gothic leaders and followed Gothic customs. They simply did so within the Roman borders in exchange for providing the army with soldiers. When these Visigoths arrived inside the borders of the Roman Empire, those who didn't immediately go east to provide military support were put into camps. But not like the fun kind, more like a 4th century concentration camp. You see, the Goths were in an incredibly desperate situation. By the time they reached the Roman border, they were experiencing a brutal famine, and thus they were completely at the mercy of the Romans. And the Romans stationed at the camp did what Romans do best, and took advantage of this desperation for some quick and easy profit. You see, the Romans had an abundance of dogs, but needed slaves, and the Goths had an abundance of children, but needed food. So they came to a mutually beneficial agreement. The Goths can get food, dog meat, from the Romans, and all they have to do is sell their own children into slavery. According to the Roman historian Ammianus Marcellinus, they made this trade at a rate of 1 child per dog. Unsurprisingly, the Visigoths didn't put up with this sell us your children or starve deal for long, and soon they were rising up in open rebellion. Before long, these Gothic rebels had taken control of the Roman province of Thrace, which is like that little bit of European Turkey. In 378, Valens led his army to take on these Goths near the city of Adrianople. The battle was a catastrophic failure for the Romans, like one of their worst ever. 2/3 of their army was killed along with the emperor himself. Valens' successor, Theodosius I, placated the Visigoths and then used many of them himself in civil wars against the Roman usurper Magnus Maximus and the Western Emperor Eugenius. Eugenius was himself a puppet of the Frankish and therefore barbarous Arbogast, and in this civil war, along with all the following ones, barbarian troops would make up a large percentage of the soldiers on both sides, and often from this point forward, the usurpers themselves would be Germanic. The Visigoths thus became an important force in internal Roman politics for the first time ever. Soon enough, they'd be joined in this position by many other barbarian peoples. In 406 CE, a massive group of them coalesced on the Romans' eastern border along the Rhine River. On New Year's Eve of that year, this confederation of Alans, Suebi, and Vandals crossed the undefended frozen Rhine and made their way into Gaul. Now, you might say that this is a fair point to mark the fall of Rome. Their borders are made out of silly putty, and any group of people can walk into their lands and become a powerful political force within. Or, you might say it's collapsed since, by now, these foreigners are starting to take direct control of the state. As you may have come to expect at this point, though, I disagree. Ancient borders were much more vague and undefined than what we're used to nowadays. Barbarians had been violating them to raid or trade or as federates for centuries. And as for the fact that these foreigners were in control of the state, well, barbarians Romanized. They did. Obviously, this comes with some caveats. It's difficult to tell to what extent a wide variety of people groups assimilated to Roman culture 1,500 years ago, but we do have evidence of it, especially amongst the powerful aristocrats and generals who were infiltrating the top levels of the Roman state. Stilicho, one of the powerful barbarians who puppeted an emperor, himself had a Roman mother, and by all accounts was culturally Roman. Theodoric the Great of the Ostrogoths was even raised in Constantinople as a hostage. Here is a quote on the subject from the historian Henri Perrin, who argued antiquity only came to an end with the Muslim conquest beginning in the 6th century. And there was no longer any question of closing the empire to the barbarians. The barbarians were needed, as soldiers and as agricultural laborers. They asked nothing better than to enter the service of Rome. Thus, the empire on its frontiers became Germanized in respect of blood, but not otherwise, for all who entered the empire became Romanized. No sooner did they enter it than they adopted its language and also its religion, that is to say Christianity after the 4th century, and in becoming Christians, in losing their national gods and frequenting the same churches, they gradually merged into the population of the empire. Because of the complex nature of these migrations, it's been suggested that barbarian invasions is an inaccurate term. Peter Brown, historian and guy who coined the term late antiquity, describes it instead as a gold rush from the underdeveloped countries of the north into the rich lands of the Mediterranean. Another thing I'd like to point out here is that this phenomenon of people from the outskirts of the Roman world becoming politically significant wasn't anything new. The entire idea of what it meant to be Roman slowly evolved and expanded as the empire did. It began as a city-state, and thus to be Roman for a majority of the Republican period meant to be from the city of Rome specifically. Only following the Social War in 90 BCE was this definition expanded. Now Romans could be from Italy, at least in terms of citizenship. By the time the Republic died, the Romans already controlled basically the entire Mediterranean world, and thus over the course of the empire, this definition expanded further. People from one city simply can't effectively control an area this wide. The definition of Roman had to expand, and so it did. You might look at Theodoric the Great and say, well, look at him, he's German, how could he be Roman? But if you went back in time and told, say, Julius Caesar about the Emperor Trajan, he'd have the same reaction. A Roman magistrate? But he's barbarous, he was born in Hispania. And yet, he was arguably the most successful emperor in history, and was revered and beloved by Romans in his time and after. His nickname, the Optimus Princeps, given by the Senate, literally translates to the best emperor. By the time the 3rd century crisis came about, there would be basically no Roman emperors born in Rome again. They're mostly born in Dalmatia, this area afterwards. Put this precedent aside for a second though, and let's consider other societies. China had 2 foreign dynasties in its history, the Yuan dynasty established by the Mongols after Genghis Khan shenanigans, and the last dynasty, the Qing. Does anyone consider the Yuan or Qing dynasties to be the fall of China? Or what about Europe? Catherine the Great of Russia? German. Queen Victoria? Half German. William the Conqueror? Oh, you probably thought he was British. Nope, he's a French Viking. So, have the English or Russian empires collapsed? Well, probably with the William example, but who really cares, right? If you could somehow make the argument that the ethnic makeup of the ruling class determines whether or not an empire remains, it would just kind of make the entire question pointless. Okay, when a German runs Russia, Russia has fallen. But literally the only people who care about that fact live inside the royal palace. To the vast majority of society, all the millions of everyday people, nothing has changed. Tell an 18th century peasant that the Tsar is German, and they'll probably ask you what a German is and to help them deal with tax farmers. It just doesn't matter to the majority of an empire's inhabitants. Ask a Gallic peasant whether his patron is a Roman or a barbarian, and they'd have a similar reaction. To point at the genetic or ethnic background of the occupant of the state's highest office as evidence that said state has either fallen or continues to exist is logically flawed, of course, but it also just sounds kind of racist, right? Especially when the state in question is basically synonymous with civilization and an imagined golden age, and when the era which followed it is called the Dark Ages. Even if this argument is applied to the broad demographic shift that occurred in the migration period, it still feels hollow and, let's say, racially dubious. Migrations happen all the time and they never mean the end of an empire. Of course, most migrations aren't even close to as severe and consequential as the Volkenwanderung, which admittedly did result in a lot of political and social changes, but a lot of those changes had already begun to take shape within the Roman Empire before the barbarians even moved in. There were a number of trends within the Roman political and economic system which helped to give rise to the medieval state of things, let's say. So let's look at these trends. Obviously, one of the biggest differences between the Roman world and the medieval one was the profound urban character of the Roman Empire. The ruling class of antiquity all hung out in sprawling cities, whereas those of medieval Europe stayed at home in their fiefs. So what's the cause of this? Well, a lot of things, but let's start with demographics again, specifically the demographics of the Roman Senate. The Roman Senate was not an elected body, but rather a collection of Rome's most powerful ex and current magistrates. Importantly, there was a super steep wealth requirement to be in the Roman Senate, so we can see it as the wealthiest arm of the ruling class, and the one which made administrative decisions. This was the center of the Roman oligarchy. Originally, of course, the Senate was composed of only people born in the city of Rome, but just as with the rest of the empire, as its borders expanded, so too did the category of people allowed to join the Senate. And so, as powerful Roman families fell on hard times and dropped below the property requirement, or, especially in times of civil war like the end of the Republic or 3rd century crisis, they completely died out, they'd sometimes be replaced by provincial oligarchs rather than Italian ones. By the time of the 6th Emperor Vespasian in 70 CE, the Senate was made up of 16.8% non-Italians, and by the 3rd century, this number had risen to 56%. Why does this matter? Well, I'll get there, but there's more changes I have to explain first. Changes which primarily involved the Roman economy. The Roman aristocracy made their money from slave gangs who worked large-scale agricultural estates known as latifundia. These latifundia were able to outcompete everyone else since slavery is very profitable and big farms are more efficient than small farms. So, these Roman aristocrats utilized the Rockefeller maneuver and bought out all their competition. Over the course of centuries, this caused the destruction of most of the Roman West's smallholder population, as well as the creation of some truly massive latifundia. But this was all a process taking place in the late Republic. The history of Rome's imperial period begins in the midst of this transformation. So where does that leave us in terms of the land situation by the end of the imperial period? Well, it was about 400 years worse. By the 5th century CE, many latifundia had become so large, in fact, that people started to confuse them with cities and their owners with magistrates. Agenius Urbicus, some guy who wrote about agriculture in probably the late 4th century, described the situation like this. Many estates indeed are far larger than the districts. They have, however, in private estates a far from scanty plebeian population, and villages around the villa in the manner of free towns. Many latifundia had grown so large that they were starting to become entirely self-sufficient. Another writer from the same time period, Rutilius Taurus Aemilianus Palladius, let's hope he had a pen name, wrote, "Running a late antiquity mega plantation for dummies." His advice to the Roman aristocracy was to invest in a bunch of artisans and craftsmen for their estate so their peasants would never have to leave to go to the city, which suggests this was a common practice. These two trends, the Senate becoming increasingly provincial and the growing size of Latifundia, resulted in a decline in attendance of the Senate. The most powerful men in the Roman Empire started staying home. I can see where they were coming from, though. I mean, would you leave the comfort of your own mini-kingdom and walk all the way to Italy just to do some administrative crap in Ravenna? The urban world of the Roman Empire was by this point in a serious decline. As the aristocracy left the cities to stay in their private villas, so too did the money. With no rich people to pay for the physical upkeep of the cities, they began to decay and decline. Aristocratic wealth leaving the cities also meant that there were no longer any rich yuppies to pay all the craftsmen and artisans, which further incentivized them to flee to private estates. Maybe you'd bother with traveling such a long way from your estate if you'd be arriving in Rome in its prime, but that Rome was a distant memory, and the Rome was not even the capital of the Western Empire anymore. What happened to Rome, Stickman? You promised me you'd stay quiet while I filmed the video. I guess I have to talk about you now. The city of Rome was sacked twice in the 5th century, which hadn't happened in almost 1,000 years. Now again, let me reiterate that Rome was no longer the capital. At this point, it really only mattered as an important Christian city and symbolically. Still, these are important moments to address, so let's start with the first one. The 410 sack of Rome was carried out by a Visigoth named Alaric. You might even call Alaric the Visigoth. In one of the million civil wars amongst Romans in late antiquity, the man who would go on to be the last emperor of the whole Roman Empire, Theodosius, fought alongside a ton of Visigothic federati. Alaric led these Gothic forces and they won the civil war, making Theodosius the sole Roman emperor. So what did that mean for Alaric? Well, there was a large difference between Alaric's expectations and his reality. He expected to be appointed Magister Militum, and he expected to get a bunch of money out of it. But in reality, he didn't. Also, the Visigoths had suffered massive casualties in the war because the Romans put them all in the front lines. They suspected that the Romans had done so in a deliberate attempt to kill them off, and they were absolutely right. So in lieu of direct compensation, Alaric decided to just start plundering Greece with his Goths. In 402, Alaric was confronted by Stilicho, the half-barbarian puppet master of the Western Emperor. Alaric lost the battle, although he retained a sizable military, and thus had to accept Stilicho's dominance in the West, while still winning some concessions for himself. In return for his capitulation, he was given the highly sought-after Magister Militum title, just what he wanted. This I find very interesting. Alaric was quite different from other famous Roman foes. Hannibal and his father Hamilcar Barca, for example, supposedly had an intense, undying hatred of Rome. Hannibal invaded with a foreign army and desired nothing less than the total destruction of the Roman state. Alaric, on the other hand, invaded with an allied army in order to secure himself a Roman magistracy. Isn't that strange? Imagine if Putin went on TV tomorrow and said, "We will never surrender until I, Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin, am appointed Ukrainian Secretary of Defense." It wouldn't make sense, right? Well, that's the point. Alaric wasn't exclusively a foreign ruler. He was a foreign ruler. There's no denying that's part of what he was. The Visigoths were federates. They were not an integrated part of Roman society. But that isn't all he was. Clearly, he was also an important force within Roman internal politics. Invading Rome to secure oneself a position in Roman politics was, again, Roman as hell. That move had been in the playbook ever since Sulla used it in the very first civil war, all the way back in 83 BCE. Don't get me wrong, power within the bounds of the Roman state was far from the only thing Alaric wanted. He wanted money and power in general, and so to get it, he often worked outside of or even against the Roman state. But it's interesting that he didn't work entirely outside of it. It's important to keep in mind the level of power Alaric and other Gothic kings would have had at this time, which wasn't a lot. Alaric would only remain king as long as he could satisfy the needs of his people and retinue, otherwise he'd be deposed and replaced. What did his people want? Money, of course, and so Alaric had to get gold from the Roman state through agreement, plunder, or extortion. Thus, a few years after he became Magister Militum, he marched his army on Italy again and forced Stilicho to bribe him with 4,000 pounds of gold. A year later, Stilicho was couped, and following his death, the Roman troops slaughtered the barbarians in Italy en masse. Alaric, with strangely light pockets and, this is just my theory, but maybe a little annoyed at the little proto-genocide the Romans just did, decided to pull the same extortion stunt on the newly unpuppeted Emperor Honorius. This time, though, Alaric was concerned with his people's needs primarily. They wanted money, sure, but what they needed was a place to permanently settle down. They needed land. Alaric suggested a deal to the emperor to grant his people land in Noricum, an area which the empire had already lost effective control over anyway. Honorius refused to pay though, so Alaric marched south to Rome to demand his ransom there. Honorius couldn't do anything but watch as Alaric marched on Rome, because a usurper from Britain named Constantine III was waiting just beyond the Alps ready to invade Italy. So, the Visigoths started to besiege Rome and sent their demands to the inhabitants. Those demands were quite simple. All the gold, all the silver, all the household goods, and all the barbarian slaves. To this, the Roman ambassador he was speaking to supposedly asked Alaric what would be left for the citizens if they gave up this much, to which Alaric replied, "Their souls." Anyways, that wasn't important, but historical figures rarely get the chance to deliver action movie one-liners, so I thought I should bring it up. Anyways, after Alaric got paid, he started hearing some rumors that Honorius was planning on sending a force of Huns to go stab him. Working well under pressure, Alaric came up with an idea: turn the Romans against the Roman state in Ravenna. So, Alaric told the Romans to select for themselves a candidate for Roman emperor, so that he could bring him to Ravenna and replace Honorius. The Romans chose this guy named Attalus to be Alaric's puppet emperor. This was a huge mistake for the Romans. In response to the Romans taking sides with Alaric, Honorius ordered the governor of Africa to stop sending the city grain shipments. Food was already scarce because of the recently ended siege, but this order made things so much worse. Merchants started hoarding what little grain there was left to make themselves rich off extortionist prices, and people started eating each other. Anyways, leaving behind the humanitarian disaster developing in Rome for a minute, Attalus, Alaric, and the Visigoths go north to Ravenna to once again negotiate with Honorius. Attalus evidently wasn't being a very good puppet, so Alaric deposed him once they got to Ravenna. Honorius said he would share the empire, Alaric turned him down, and then, while they were negotiating, Honorius sent a rival Goth at the head of a Roman army to go stab Alaric. It didn't work, and at this point Alaric had had enough and went back to go sack Rome. It's interesting to me that this sack of Rome was perpetrated by somebody after they'd gotten sick of being denied a promotion. Alaric mutinies in Greece after being denied Magister Militum, and then marches on Italy and is only placated by being given that position. On top of that, his ultimate sack of Rome came as the result of Honorius attacking him while he was negotiating to have himself or a puppet appointed as emperor. And yet, we know that he wasn't scared or otherwise unwilling to attack Rome if that would advance his ambitions more effectively. So what's my point? Mostly just that the political situation in the late Western Empire was incredibly complicated. The sack of Rome should never be simplified to simply the idea that barbarians sacked the Eternal City. The issue is incredibly complex. Was Alaric a foreign king sacking an enemy city for profit? In some ways, certainly yes, he was those things, but he was also a part of a proud tradition of Roman politicians using force to demand positions in government, a true microcosm of the dialectical change taking place throughout late antiquity between barbarian power and culture and those of Rome. Anyways, how did Alaric get into Rome? Well, that's actually up for interpretation. Rome's walls seem to have been too high for the Visigoths to overcome, but their alternative method for gaining entrance has been obscured somewhat by the passage of time. A church historian who lived through the events, Sozomen, says that Alaric retraced his steps, returned to Rome, and took it by treachery. As for what took it by treachery means, we must turn to a historian writing 150 years after the events, Procopius. Procopius offers two possible accounts. Procopius' first account features the Visigoths pulling some Troy-style shenanigans. Alaric goes to the Romans and says, Alright, you win. You guys waited us out, and now we're bored of sieging your city. We'll just see ourselves out. But before we go, for being such good sports about this whole thing, we'd like to give you 300 slaves as a gift." The Romans gladly accepted this gift, and were sleeping like babies when the slaves, who were actually the 300 strongest and bravest young Visigoth soldiers in Alaric's army, opened up the city's gates for the rest of the army to enter. Procopius is then like, "Alright, I know that sounds a little fantastical, so maybe somebody just felt bad for the starving, cannibalistic Romans and decided to open the gates to relieve the siege." This sack is often seen as a significant marker for the collapse of the Roman Empire, because a foreign king hadn't sacked Rome since Brennus a millennia earlier, when Rome was still this. But as we've seen, calling Alaric a foreign king doesn't entirely describe him. And the city of Rome may not have been sacked since the early days of the Republic, but it certainly wasn't the first time precedent around the city had been broken. In Sulla's day, it was just as taboo to march an army into Rome, and yet he still did so, and that became a regular occurrence during the late Republic. Who's to say whether the great generals of the late Republic would have sacked Rome if it had been what it had become by 410 CE? A regional backwater, decaying from over a century of neglect, no longer the capital of the empire or even an important strategic city. The sack of Rome, to me, demonstrates more the decline both in status and importance of the city of Rome itself than it does the fall of the empire. Or else, wouldn't violently breaching its traditional rules in other ways, as Sulla and Caesar had done, demonstrate that too? Anyways, we're done with that. Back to the internal transitions. In late antiquity, the Roman peasantry, which was pretty much everyone, could be divided into two primary groups: slaves, called servi, and free tenant farmers, known as coloni. However, various laws throughout late antiquity show that the distinctions between these two groups had begun to disappear as the status of slaves slowly and steadily rose, while the opposite happened to the colony. The result was the slow melding of these two into a sort of proto-serf class. For servi, this took place as the result of the decline in the slave mode of production. As you might expect, the expansion of the Roman Republic from this to this in only 150 years had some major effects on the economy. It made a lot of Romans very rich, and a lot of non-Romans very property. As a result, those rich Romans bought more and more land, and more of those newly enslaved people to work it. The economy became dominated by the production of this slave class on latifundia. Population estimates for antiquity are tricky and by no means are they precise, but the estimates we do have show the sheer scale of Roman slavery to be pretty insane. In 225 BCE, there were some 4.4 million free persons in Italy to 600,000 slaves. By 43 BCE, there were perhaps 4.5 million free to 3 million slave inhabitants. The Roman Empire boasted one of the highest enslaved populations per capita in history. The importance of slavery to the Roman economy is further illustrated when you consider how many of these slaves were working in the most productive sectors of the economy, those huge latifundia. All this to say that the economic base that this whole eternal city and grand empire were built on was inseparably connected to the institution of slavery. And that worked really well for them for a few hundred years. They got all the wealth of the Mediterranean and public works and bread and even circuses. But eventually, as the title of this section probably tipped you off to, the system came into some problems. Specifically, these problems stemmed from the Romans' inability to maintain the population of enslaved people within the empire. To understand this problem, we're going to have to take a look at how Roman slavery functioned at an individual level. So sorry about this, but imagine you're a Roman slave owner. You're in the market looking for the newest addition to your collection, and you see three options before you. Option 1 is a fit, able-bodied 20-something-year-old man. Option 2 is a fit, able-bodied 20-something-year-old woman. And option 3 is a child. Now, hearing these three options, I imagine you've got some ideas floating around your head about what to choose. Option 3 seems pretty decent. A child is going to live longer and thus give you more value in the long term. Maybe option 2 sounds pretty decent, especially if you're a remorseless pervert. But you're actually wrong on both fronts. While slavery was obviously intensely lucrative for the Romans, it wasn't like a get-rich-quick scheme. Slaves were incredibly expensive commodities, and if you wanted your purchase to turn a profit, you had to watch your margins carefully. What things tended to eat away your margins? Feeding child slaves until they were old enough to work, feeding pregnant or nursing mothers until they were childless enough to work, and whatever minor decrease in productive capacity female slaves had over male ones. So, our guy over here doesn't buy the woman or the child, and eventually, word of that gets back to the people selling the slaves, and they realize these ones aren't as worth our time. We can kidnap less of them. As the result of this, the population of enslaved females is much lower than that of the males. When you combine this with the high cost of growing and raising children, the result is a slave-owning class which is generally unconcerned with the upkeep of the enslaved population.
On top of this, the Romans were actually famous for freeing their slaves. It was a favorite custom of theirs.
So the population of enslaved people within the Roman Empire tended to decline. Consequently, the slave mode of production could not reproduce itself naturally, and was forced to do so through other means. So what were those other means? How did the Roman Empire enslave people?
There's all sorts of different ways to enslave somebody, and the Romans were no stranger to many of them. For example, somebody might run up enough debts that they or a member of their family might be enslaved. This is known as debt peonage. Where one runs into problems, however, is with enslaving this many people, and doing it over and over again when all those slaves die. You can try enslaving that many people through debt, but this line of thinking is what led to basically every social revolution and revolt in pre-modern history, so I wouldn't unless you want your head on a pike. Another, more widespread strategy for enslaving people was integral to the ancient system for abortions. There were real ways of having actual terminate the pregnancy, kill the fetus type abortions in the ancient world, but these were pretty dangerous for the mother. So the more common solution if you couldn't take care of your baby was to give birth, find a suitable trash heap or underpass or what have you, place the baby there, and then walk away. Then, later on, if the baby was lucky, some Roman passing by would hear the baby's cries, walk over, kidnap, and enslave it.
Holy shit. What? There's a baby in this dumpster.
The Romans messed around with debt peonage and enslaving unwanted babies, but they only really dabbled. The real enslavements begun overseas.
The bulk of people enslaved by the Romans were stolen through conquest. This was a fine solution while they were bullying the fragile states of the late Hellenistic Mediterranean, but as we've seen, their expansion eventually reached a wall, known as the Persians, or Parthians, or maybe Sassanids. The last Roman conquest came under Trajan in the early 2nd century CE, and the end of conquest also meant the end of fresh enslavements, and thus the beginning of the decline in the slave mode of production. Thus, the Roman world was plunged into an existential economic crisis. As the supply dropped, prices for slaves skyrocketed, and it began to be more economically feasible to just give your peasant a small piece of land and then simply take what they don't eat. This was presumably better for the slave, but interestingly, it was also clearly a better arrangement for the patron, because we have evidence that they were willing to pay more than it would cost to purchase a slave in order to keep one of their little proto-serfs from being conscripted into the military. Our first look at the diminution of the status of Roman colony comes from a decree of Emperor Diocletian, the architect of the post-3rd century crisis political system. Diocletian stated that tenant farmers would be considered bound to their villages for tax collecting purposes. Bound to the land, kind of like a serf. A quarter century later, in 332 AD, Constantine made this an official law. Despite the increasingly similar conditions of colony in Serbia at this point, however, there was still a distinction, since the law threatens enslavement as a punishment for fugitive colony. By 365, this distinction seems to have more or less disappeared entirely, though. Here is a quote from a law passed in that year. "There is no doubt that colony do not have the right to alienate the fields that they cultivate, to the extent that even if they have any belongings of their own, they may not transfer them to others without the advice and knowledge of their patrons." Sounds a lot like slavery to me. Patronage was a very important aspect of this whole economic transformation in both of the areas we've talked about so far. Let's imagine a colonist living in 5th century Gaul. His name's probably Louis. Louis is legally tied to the land he works on, and in exchange for the ability to cultivate it, he must pay the landowner rent in kind.
But Louis has a problem, a big one. Traditionally, unlike feudal lords, Roman landowners tended to have several smaller estates rather than a single large one. Thus, Louis has the misfortune of being tied to the land of an absentee owner. Louis sits alone every night, with nobody but his family to keep him company, watching his friends on the neighboring estate living it up with their patron. This was a very, very bad situation for Louis. Without the protection of a patron, he was liable to be conscripted or taxed, either of which means the kids aren't eating. So, Louis, along with millions of non-fictional colony, sought the patronage of neighboring landowners. As landowners became the patrons of the colony on their neighboring estates, they in fact became the de facto owner of that estate, since patrons exacted rent from their clients. This effect was so widespread that we can see the imperial government's attempts at damage control in a 415 law. The law recognized people who had been patronizing the peasants of a neighboring estate as the legal owner of that estate if they had done so for at least 18 years, while banning the practice going forward. The state didn't have the ability to enforce this ban by this point though, and so the law merely serves us as an indicator that this was a common issue. At first, this whole thing was a very messy process in which you might find yourself patronized by your neighboring aristocrat and your neighboring peasant patronized by your aristocrat. Eventually, though, this tendency led to the death of absenteeism as landowners consolidated the lands around their primary estate. And it wasn't just the colony who sought out patronage. Remember how I said that the expansion of large-scale latifundia destroyed most of the smallholder peasant population? Well, on top of that problem, they were also being squeezed dry by the demands of Roman tax collectors. As a result, they too desired to become clients of the large landowners, and thus, most of the remaining free peasantry was absorbed into this new proto-feudal economy. It's interesting how much this contrasts with the common narrative surrounding the development of feudalism. There's this popular understanding that feudalism in Europe developed because peasants sought the military protection of warriors from bandits and barbarians in the scary post-Roman Dark Ages. But here we can see that it's closer to the opposite. Peasants sought protection against the parasitic demands of the Roman state for increasing taxation and military recruitment. A new power structure was naturally and slowly replacing the old one, and with the demographic developments taking place, this more and more often meant that peasants were seeking the protection of barbarian aristocrats from the Roman state. So let's get back to the barbarians, shall we? So how were the barbarians eventually integrated into the Roman economy and society? Well, surprisingly enough, with hospitality. The Romans were so kind to their new barbarian guests, or hospiti, that they developed an arrangement in the law to accommodate them. This legal arrangement is known to historians as the system of Hospitalitas, and its details are pretty contentious. This is because Hospitalitas wasn't a new law, but rather new interpretations of old laws used to facilitate barbarian integration. As such, it's fairly contentious which laws were used in what places, and there are several theories. The first theory is that Hospitalitas was based on an old law for quartering troops. Louis was a peasant. I need to think of a second name for this aristocrat example. Louis II, I guess. So Louis II legally has to allow Roman soldiers to live on and use his land sometimes. And so, once the barbarians entered the scene, the same law was slightly twisted in order to force him to allow the barbarians to do this in perpetuity. According to the second theory, Hospitalitas was instead based on the Roman laws surrounding gifting land to veterans. Since most barbarian groups were foederati at one point or another, this makes some sense. Maybe Louis II was just helping out some poor veterans. The third theory is the odd one out. This theory says that Hospitalitas was born out of late Roman tax law. Thus, the theory argues that the barbarians were simply granted the right to go out and tax farm Louis II and all his friends. Let's forget about this one though. Historians have criticized the methodology in either way. The barbarians would have just invested their money into buying land anyway. It's all you can really buy.
However, it was squared away legally, which may well have been different in different places. Through Hospitalitas, the barbarians came into control of a lot of Roman farmland. How much exactly has been largely obscured by the passage of time, but sources like legal codes make reference to thirds, or tertiae,
of Roman estates being given to individual barbarian warriors. When the barbarian leaders and their retinues acquired these lands, they settled the other barbarians who had come as tenants, and within a generation, barbarian puberty was over. They had entrenched class division. And who could have guessed that the Romans would be such selfless hosts? Well, let's not give them too much credit. This legal language describing the transition in such friendly, colorful terms is likely a cloak to obscure a more violent, or at least threatening process. You might give up a third of your land too if a bunch of Goths with pointy sticks started living on it. What might happen if you refuse? That's not a question you want to find out the answer to. On the other hand, the population of barbarians was relatively small, especially during the first wave of migrations. They were a powerful force in Roman society, but not an all-powerful force. They still had to weigh their ambitions against the potential for a Roman reaction if they were to overplay their hand. Romans might not violently resist if barbarians confiscate a third of their land, but they very well may if those numbers were closer to 100%. At the same time, you might see Hospitalitas as not only a non-coerced decision by the aristocracy, but also a smart one. If you give the pointy stick-wielding men a stake in your land, they're going to have a real financial incentive to protect that land. And who else is going to protect it? The Roman state? You? The extent to which Hospitalitas was either a smart way of convincing barbarians to protect the land, or a cloak to cover up what was essentially land taken by violence or the threat thereof, is pretty contentious. Just know that it's one or the other, or both. So here's the situation. On the one hand, we have the barbarians, moving in and making themselves at home. And on the other hand, we have the Romans, presumably not happy about losing some of their land, but happy that it's safe from banditry and nonetheless forced to use Roman law to placate the barbarians, lest they rebel and end up with more than they otherwise would have. As a result, a surprising amount of the division of the Roman Empire amongst these barbarians was done legally. This not only applies to the economy, but also to the formation of the so-called barbarian kingdoms. You might expect that something called a barbarian kingdom would have been formed through brutal violence and conquest, and that was the case sometimes, such as with the Frankish kingdom, which was carved out in the late 5th century by two important kings, Childeric I and Clovis I, by defeating the rival federates in Gaul. But interestingly, they weren't always won in this way. Sometimes the kingdoms were formed as a result of Roman political maneuvering. The Burgundians established a kingdom within Roman territory this way. Their king, Gunther, helped to prop up a man named Jovinus as Western Roman Emperor, who in turn granted the Burgundians land between Gaul and Italy. Sometime after Jovinus's defeat, the real Emperor Honorius made the land grant official as part of a truce, and the Burgundians weren't the only people who established a kingdom in nominally Roman territory, with the permission of the emperor. In addition to them, there are our old friends the Visigoths. It's been a while since we checked in on the Visigoths. How are they? And Alaric, how's he doing?
Dead, and replaced by his brother-in-law, Atholf. Atholf takes the Visigoths out of Italy and leads them into Gaul, where they'd spend a few years defeating two Roman usurpers. Emperor Honorius was charmed by this, and thus, Roman-Visigoth relations started to improve, culminating in the marriage of Atholf to Honorius' sister Galla Placidia, who had been hanging out with them ever since Alaric kidnapped her from Rome in 410. Eventually, in 419, after one more bout of backstabbing on both sides, Honorius granted the Visigoths land in Aquitaine. Haha, another one I know, that one's right there. On this land, the Visigoth federates established the Visigothic kingdom, within the Roman borders and only with the help of the Roman emperor. I told you not to open that. Now I have to talk about it. Yes, it's true, I must admit. This is the land granted to the Visigoths in their agreement with Honorius compared to the land they would eventually come to control through other means. But that's okay, it still fits with my argument. Obviously, these barbarian kingdoms came into being. What's important right now, though, is recognizing how strange it is that they sometimes did so as federates, through agreements with the Roman emperor himself. Don't get me wrong, though, this was still an opportunistic political move, not mere charity. After all, the Visigoths had proved themselves to be good federates in Gaul, capable of defeating usurpers, so having them as an ally in an area of the empire where the emperor had little influence was in Honorius' interests.
Okay, so how exactly do I square the fact that barbarian kingdoms are being set up in Roman territory with my argument that the Roman Empire still hasn't fallen. Well, remember how I said the barbarians are still going through puberty? They were. On top of that, where the barbarians eventually settled was always super far from where they started. I mean, think about the story I've been telling you about the Goths. They start here in Eastern Europe, and 50 years later, they have a kingdom that's mostly in Spain. Or take the Vandals. They start here and end up making a kingdom in Africa. The sheer distance of the journeys necessarily limited the amount of barbarian migrants. Taken together, the seeping pores of these barbarians and their relatively small numbers forced them to rely upon pre-existing Roman institutions and power structures a lot. The result, as I mentioned before, is that not a lot changed under the barbarian kingdoms. As we've already seen, they appropriated a good portion of the land, which is a big shift, but only a demographic one, and I would argue not as consequential as the slow internal evolution in landowning that we discussed earlier. But what about the rest? What else about the Roman Empire remained under the barbarian kingdoms?
So, obviously this would have differed region by region, and no doubt even within each barbarian kingdom, but as I mentioned, the rule of thumb was a general lack of profound change. In many cases, the barbarians couldn't replace Roman institutions with their own parallel ones because they had none. They had no experience administrating an empire. Most lacked a firmly rooted system of private property, in fact, which is sort of a problem when your people suddenly come into possession of 1 billion fiefdoms. And in any case, imposing new institutions, especially on Romans, was not something the relatively small numbers of barbarians were in a position to accomplish. Okay, so now we're back to take another look at Italy. If you'll remember, those other Goths who didn't fancy selling their children for dog meat made a deal with the Eastern Romans to take over Italy from Odoacer. They do, and set up a barbarian kingdom in Italy. This kingdom in particular has a lot of quintessential Roman stuff owing to the fact that it was in Italy. But don't let that fool you into thinking the others had totally transformed or anything like that. When I tell you that the Roman Senate still functioned in the Ostrogothic kingdom, for example, keep in mind that that could have only happened in this one, because there was only one Senate. But yeah, isn't that insane? In the supposedly collapsed Roman Empire, the Senate continued to meet for centuries, and everything else continued on as normal too. They elected consuls, followed Roman laws, and minted new coins with Roman emperors on them. Historian Edward J. Watts has this to say about the situation. Theodoric's regime differed from that of Trajan and Valentinian I, but no one in Italy thought that Roman life had fundamentally shifted following his arrival. Italians very much felt that the regimes of Odoacer and, especially, Theodoric were not only thoroughly Roman, but were also actually spearheading a Western Roman revival. Good quote. Here's another. Back to the Belgian, Henri Pirenne. What the Germans destroyed was not the empire, but the imperial government in parts of the West. Then, in a footnote, Pirenne lists the Roman features that were retained after the barbarian takeover of the West. The language, the currency, writing, weights and measures, the kinds of foodstuffs in common use, the social classes, the religion. The role of Arianism has been exaggerated. Art, the law, the administration, the taxes, the economic organization. Alright, now we've arrived at perhaps the biggest source of continuity between the Roman Empire and the medieval world, Christianity. Okay, so as you probably know, there was a Jewish fellow living in Roman Palestine in the 1st century AD who got crucified worse than I'm about to in the comments for calling it Palestine. That's what it is, free Palestine. The Jews were having a really hard time lately, being conquered by the Romans and all, so they were waiting on a Messiah called the Christ to come set them free again. This sort of thing happened to them a lot. Sir, there's kind of a situation developing in Jerusalem. What situation? Well, there's this wandering sage guy named Jesus who's drawn a following criticizing the city's elite. He's criticizing Jerusalem's elite? You mean all those things I have sitting under my thumb? The very same. And people are even calling him Christ. Who cares what they call him? No, sir, that means Messiah. That means he's destined to free the Jews. Free the Jews? That sounds horrible. We're the ones who have them in chains. Better crucify him worse than Stickman's gonna get crucified in the comments for calling Jesus a wandering sage. Ah, you're back. How'd crucifying Christ go? Well, they're kind of saying he came back to life, which proves that he's the Christ. Jesus, just destroy their goddamn temple already. Following Jesus' death, his popularity only grew, and over the next century or so, these Jesus-following Jews started to differentiate themselves more and more from Judaism, forming their own distinct and yet similar religion. This new religion spread across the empire pretty quickly, despite imperial repression, which flared up fairly frequently. In the midst of all the other slow political and economic transformations I've been discussing, there was also a religious one as Christianity spread. The big moment for Christianity's development, though, was when it started to merge into the Roman state, what some guy named William Boyd called the blending of civil and ecclesiastical authority. I don't know who that is, okay, but it's a good quote. It sums it up perfectly. This process began with someone you've probably heard of, Constantine. Constantine's about to fight an important battle in one of his civil wars when he tells his troops he's seen a vision of a cross with "In hoc signo vinces," with this sign you shall win, written on it. You tell me if you think that sounds like a real thing that happened, but I for one doubt it. It was most likely a more tactical move. Inspire your troops before an important battle by telling them that the god they secretly worship is on their side, or at least that some powerful god was. Furthermore, paganism, with all its thousands of cults worshipping different gods in different places, isn't really something an emperor can control. He can be included, and indeed Roman emperors were, with few exceptions, worshipped as gods. But that doesn't mean he has any control over the doctrine or organization of paganism at large. Such a thing doesn't even really make sense. This new growing religion, though, with its one god, could maybe be molded into something he could control. This wasn't as simple as putting himself at the top of the church hierarchy, though. He couldn't just break into the Pope mobile.
Out of the car! I'm taking your car!
Christianity was, up to this point, an underground and decentralized movement because of all those persecutions. In order to take advantage of this potential new power, Constantine had to get Christianity out into the open. His 313 Edict of Milan did this by legalizing the religion, but there was another problem. The early religion was scattered in both their power structure and doctrines. For Christianity to be useful to him, Constantine had to establish an orthodoxy with a clear hierarchy, power structure, and doctrine, lest it be just as chaotic and untenable as paganism. To sort out these problems, Constantine called the Council of Nicaea in 325. He had a bunch of bishops and other Christian leaders from across the empire come together to establish cohesive rules and parameters for this new religion, which became known as the Nicene Creed. The main doctrinal dispute that was to be sorted out by the Council of Nicaea had to do with the Holy Trinity and a man named Arius. Arius was a presbyter from Alexandria who became famous for his take on a controversial debate in early Christianity. It's a little complicated, and I'm by no means an expert in theology, but Arius and the others who thought this way were like, hey, if there's only one God, how is Jesus God? Like, if God is Jesus' dad, how could he be equal to God, the guy who created him? Those who would go on to form the orthodoxy weren't too bothered by this. He's just God. He's God just as much as God is, but there's only one God. And then there's the Holy Spirit, too. It's a trinity, man. But Arius and a bunch of others thought it didn't make sense. They considered Jesus holy, but less godly than God, because he's God's son. Those who agreed with Arius even after the establishment of the Nicene Creed are called Arians, and the Trinitarians consider them heretics. Arianism was pretty big in late antiquity for a while after Nicaea, particularly amongst the barbarians. Basically, all these guys got converted to Arianism at some point, and then were slowly converted to the orthodoxy thereafter. As you can probably imagine, following a minusculely different religion to the Romans played a big role in the idea that they were civilization-destroying beasts ushering in a dark age. But anyways, I'm getting ahead of myself again. Theodosius I makes Nicene Christianity the only legal religion in the empire in 380. While the Roman state was strengthening its grip on Christianity, so too did the religious apparatus start to take on some traditionally state functions. Here are some excerpts from the Theodosian Law Code which show this pretty well. Bishop's right to hear lawsuits, a decree that any Christian who so wished could have his case heard not by a regular civil judge, but by an episcopal court. all pagan temples to be closed, sacrifices banned on pain of death, and even threatening confiscation of the property of governors who fail to enforce this edict. Those guilty of the worship of images or pagan sacrifices may be subject to the death penalty. Clergy and their families are exempt from paying taxes. All heresies are forbidden by both divine and imperial laws and shall forever cease. Here we see both examples of the Christian Church gaining the authority to carry out state functions, such as hearing lawsuits, but also examples of enforcing the practices of Christianity and the forced absence of pagan practices being enforced by laws. This feels crazy from our modern secular perspective, but think about it in the mind of somebody living in the Roman Empire. He doesn't know what a Darwin is. He hasn't heard of the Big Bang. To this guy, heaven and God, or maybe gods, are just as real as you or me, and more real than Britannia, or whatever they're calling it. That sounds made up. If this guy doesn't live his life right, he knows where they're gonna send him.
Thirsty, thirsty, Thursday. Yodeling, yodeling. Yodeling, yodeling. Yodeling, yodeling. Thirsty, thirsty, Thursday.
And these guys, the bishops and presbyters and priests, they're the experts in how to not go here.
Yodeling, yodeling. Thirsty, thirsty, Thursday.
In a world where God and heaven and hell are unquestioned facts of life, of course religious officials become powerful political agents. Honestly, who even cares about politics if when you die, you'll either spend eternity in a paradise or being tortured? Just spend your life trying to avoid the latter. Sure, a politician has power, but a bishop has divine power. That's a trump card. And as the power of the Roman state waned or even disappeared in some places, the Catholic Church, an institution invested with Roman state power, often filled the gaps. For me, the most telling instances of church power replacing state power came in the form of foreign policy. For example, Pope Leo I stepped in and saved Rome's behind in the face of invasion 2 separate times, while the Roman state was nowhere to be seen. This was a significant step up from one of his predecessors, Innocent I. Leading up to the Visigothic sack of Rome, Innocent was not coming to the city's rescue, but instead asking Honorius for help and engaging in pagan rituals. Yeah, pretty wild for the Bishop of Rome, but things were getting very dire. As to what exactly took place, we're left with an open question because of biased sources. The Christians say they performed sacrifices, which clearly had no effect. And the pagans say they got to the sacrificing thing as part of the scroll, and lost their stomachs, and look where that got them. Then, during the actual sack, Innocent was hiding away in Ravenna. So pretty lackluster performance from Innocent, not really living up to his name, but just like everything else with this whole blending of civic and ecclesiastical authority thing, it was evolving over time. Leo here, who came later on, is much more impressive. I mean, he saved Rome from the Huns. Alright, okay, my bad guys, I forgot about the Huns. We gotta get ourselves up to speed on their exploits. The Huns were a big problem for the Romans, and not just because of the refugee crisis they created amongst the barbarians. They were sacking cities and demanding tribute and all that good stuff, but luckily for us, that was mostly affecting the Eastern Empire, so we'll continue in the proud tradition of ignoring that. What we're interested in was their plans for the West, which, in 451, depended upon the outcome of one of history's most consequential military engagements, the Battle of the Catalanian Plains. In 451, Attila crossed the Rhine and made his way into northern Gaul, meeting the Western Roman army in June. On one side of the battlefield, a coalition of Romans and Federati, under the command of the Western Magister Militum Aetius, who is described as Procopius as the last of the Romans. With him, commanding a massive force of Federate Visigoths, is their king, Theodoric I. Not that one! Will these two and their armies be able to hold back the unstoppable force that is Attila and keep the Roman Empire from becoming a Hunnic domain? Everything. The legacy of the Roman Empire, the survival of civilization in Europe, a third thing that I couldn't think of, hinges on the outcome of this battle. So let's jump right to the outcome. The battle is hard fought and there's lots of casualties on both sides, including Theodoric, that Goth king. But hey, I mean, it looks like the Huns are packing up and heading back to Hungary, so I guess we can call that a Roman victory, right? Well, no, actually, it's not that simple. This battle has long been considered a Roman victory, but that's mostly due to a misunderstanding of Hunnic motivations. I mean, this battle was a huge deal. If Attila was the victor, why didn't he conquer all the western provinces? Isn't that what we were so worried he would do? Well, yeah, but that's not what we should have been worried about. Unfortunately, our disregard for the Byzantines has caused us to miss something. To understand the Hunnic goals in the Western Empire, we'll have to examine their strategy against the Byzantines. In 447 CE, Attila and the Huns had the Byzantines completely at their mercy. They had captured almost every major city in the Balkans and were on their way to a defenseless Constantinople. Yet, they chose not to conquer the empire. Instead, they set up Hunnic fiefs just south of the Roman border at the Danube River. Historian Hyun-Jin Kim argues that the Huns did this in order to set up a buffer zone with the Romans to help keep in all their new barbarian subjects, who were, of course, flooding across the Roman borders all the time. More importantly, though, they demanded tribute from the Byzantines. Now, tribute doesn't seem all that great to us in the modern day, because we like to see more color on the maps or whatever. But to Attila, it was just as good. Imagine the Mediterranean as a bank, and the Roman Empire as a bank robber. Attila could go through the trouble of killing the emperor and replacing him as the bank robber, but that sounds like a lot of work. If, however, he leaves the bank robber alive, he can just rob the robber on his way home from the bank. Now Attila can rob the whole Mediterranean while the Romans do all the hard work for him. So, you can see why the Huns would want tribute. And I think it goes without saying why they wanted to keep their subjects. Doing work is hard. It's much easier to force someone else to do it. Their strategy in the west was much the same. Attila's goals at the Battle of the Catalanian Plains was to decisively defeat the Roman army to scare the barbarians into joining or remaining in the Hunnic camp, and to give them leverage in order to exact tribute. This is clear because of their strange decision to invade Gaul, the province where the Roman army was, rather than Italy, which was much richer and less well defended. As for their post-battle retreat back to Hungary, standard practice for them at the end of campaigning season. The huge Hunnic win that was the Battle of the Catalanian Plains was made clear the following year, though, when they returned. In 452, Attila and the Huns entered Italy, which Aetius had no army to defend, a pretty good indicator of his failure the previous year, and received a boatload of tribute before once again returning to Hungary. But the next year, in 453, Attila would die under mysterious circumstances, plummeting the Huns into a civil war over succession that would pretty much remove them as a major threat to the empire. As a result, the Battle of the Catalanian Plains is seen as a turning point leading to the Hunnic collapse 2 years later, when it really wasn't. Okay, we're caught up on the Huns now. What does this all have to do with papal foreign policy? Well, at the head of the delegation to pay Attila all that tribute was Pope Leo I. This is often seen by Christian historians as the Pope divinely convincing the legendary villain Attila the Hun to not sweep in and destroy Italy with his holy writ or whatever. That's not what it was, though. I have to give props to the Pope for stepping in and saving people's lives here, but to be clear, he didn't save Italy with his silver tongue. He just gave Attila everything he wanted, the Western Roman Empire, as a tributary state. But whatever, forget about my side point about Attila for a second. The important thing here is that the Pope stepped in to do what a state should, while the state actors like Aetius were preoccupied. If you thought that was good, though, wait until you hear how he handled the Vandal sack of 455. Pope Leo was great, honestly. You'll never hear me say this about people from Antiquity, but I'm rocking with Pope Leo. He gets the stickman stamp of approval. Anyways, second sack time. Three years after the Battle of the Catalanian Plains, the Magister Militum, Aetius, has a bit of a falling out with the Emperor Valentinian III. Valentinian says, "You're trying to take over the empire, Aetius." And then Aetius says, "I would never do that." And then I say, "What? He hasn't already?" And then they both give me a weird look. And then Valentinian stabs Aetius. Some of Aetius's friends were thinking the same thing as me, and killed Valentinian in response shortly thereafter. They put Petronius Maximus, who may or may not have been one of the conspirators, on the throne. In order to try and legitimize this new emperor, Petronius and his allies started devising some marriage schemes. Petronius would force Valentinian's widow, Empress Eudoxia, to marry him, and her daughter, Eudokia, to marry his son Palladius. This would prove to be a fatal mistake. You see, Eudokia had been betrothed to the son of the Vandal king Gyseric, who had established a kingdom in the Roman province of Africa. At this point, Eudoxia supposedly wrote to Gyseric, pleading with him to invade and save her and her daughter from Petronius, although modern historians are skeptical that such an invitation was sent out. Anyways, the cancellation of the upcoming marriage alliance between Rome and the Vandals convinced Gyseric to go sack Rome. As the Vandals approached the city, many of the city's rich yuppies fled. Emperor Petronius himself tried to flee rather than organize a defense of the city, and in response he was stabbed by a soldier, torn apart by the mob, and then tossed in the Tiber. Thus, the defense of the city fell once again to Pope Leo. When the Vandals arrived, Leo met them at the gate and offered them a deal. Leo would hand over all the church's valuables and open the gates of the city as long as the Vandals agreed to not kill anybody, not burn down any buildings, and not to torture anybody to find their hidden valuables. The Vandals agreed, Leo opened the gates, and then they leisurely removed all of the city's valuables over the course of 14 days. So, the predictable infighting amongst the Roman state spurred on the sack, at which point the victor of the dispute tried to shirk the responsibilities that came with his newfound power, leaving the job of defending the city to the church. Thus, in some ways the continued existence of the organized Nicene Christian Church after 476 represents the continuation of the Roman Empire. This was an institution which the Roman Empire brought into prominence and invested with state power, all the while attempting to keep it under its thumb. Maybe we should look at the early Christian church as a Roman state institution and the medieval one as evidence of Rome's survival. Don't let me overstate my case though. Proving something like that would take a lot more than what I've provided. But imagine the ship of Theseus again. The late imperial administration replaced some of its boards with these funky Christian ones, and those Christian boards remained on the ship for basically ever. But remember, those Christian boards are Roman. Okay, and now we've come to my favorite piece of continuity, the made-up stuff. Before we get back into the video, I'm going to do a magic trick. I want you to open up Google right now and look up any person I've mentioned by name in this video and find out what their first name is, but don't tell me yet. As long as you didn't pick the Hun or somebody from a different time period I brought up in passing like Caesar, this trick will work regardless of if they're Roman or barbarian. Okay, you've got it? Was the name Flavius? Yes, I knew it. Oh, you want to know how I did the trick? I don't think you really understand how magic works. Oh, come on, how'd you get out? But yes, it's true. Everyone was named Flavius. Constantine, Odoacer, Stilicho, Honorius, Aetius, and 100 other prominent Romans that I haven't mentioned. This video is already way too long to include a section dedicated to explaining the evolution of Roman names, but Ramaboo Ramblings has a good video explaining it that I'll link in the description if you're interested. Basically, Flavius is a cognomen, which functioned as a first name during Republican times, but under the Empire it had morphed into a status symbol mostly. Following the Edict of Caracalla, basically all the commoners became Marcus Aurelius X. After Constantine, all the emperors started taking his cognomen, Flavius, as their own to show their connection to him, and by extension, Romanness. Eventually, Flavius becomes almost like a title that anybody powerful within the empire would adopt. When barbarians like Odoacer and Stilicho end up taking on the name, they do so in order to show their connection to the empire. This is merely an aesthetic feature, of course. It shows a connection to the past, but just a desired one. But you can't single out the barbarians for creating an imaginary continuity to Rome. So did everybody else. You might have been confused when I said everyone became known as Marcus Aurelius after the Edict of Caracalla. Well, all the new citizens of the empire had to adopt Roman names, and this worked the same way slaves gaining freedom did. They took the name of the person who freed them. In this case, Caracalla, who had taken on the name of Marcus Aurelius to give himself legitimacy through connection to a long-dead emperor from a previous dynasty. What connection does Caracalla have to Marcus Aurelius that Odoacer doesn't have to Constantine? What connection did Orestes' son have to Romulus or Augustus that Alaric didn't have? This will probably seem like semantics, me arguing about names, but you have to understand that names like Flavius were an important piece of manufacturing legitimacy for Romans and barbarians. But it's more than just names. There are several instances of Roman titles being used long after 476 as a way of deriving political legitimacy through a connection to Rome. You could say that that legitimacy isn't real and it's only sought after cynically, but I'd say the same thing about all the emperors from before 476 who used connections to that same history for the same purposes, after getting the job by murdering their predecessor. Clovis, king of the Franks, was a patrician according to the Eastern Empire. And there's a few more examples, but one in particular that reappeared in 540 CE was very surprising to me. The title of Western Roman Emperor. In that year, a man named Flavius Belisarius was besieging Ravenna at the head of a Byzantine army. Ignoring the delegation sent by the Byzantine Emperor Justinian, the leaders in the city instead tried to surrender to Belisarius directly by offering him the title of Roman Emperor. Interesting that they would offer him the throne of an empire that had supposedly not existed for 80 years. Now it's time to explain how this narrative originated. Where does the idea that the Roman Empire fell come from? In the words of the historian Alexander Demant, the fall of Rome was neither perceived as an event nor felt as a problem. So how exactly did this imagined problem come to be? Well, it all has to do with imperial propaganda and the Byzantine reconquest of Italy. As we've seen, the Romans love civil wars, and who could blame them really? They're great, for some people. The winning general gets all the wealth and power of a whole new chunk of the empire when they win. Isn't that something? Yeah, it's pretty fantastic, for the victorious general, that is. But for regular folk, it's not so great. In foreign wars, they're bringing in loot and new territory that's sometimes given out to the veterans, or protecting the motherland from invaders. But in civil wars, they're just dividing up what's already theirs between the elites. It's only good for the winning general, so sometimes they require some good old propaganda to get everyone else on board. The most famous example of this would be Augustus. He framed his last civil war, the one he fought against Mark Antony to give himself hegemony over both halves of the Roman Empire, as a war against Cleopatra. The Byzantine Emperor Justinian made a similar decision, to sanction an imperial propaganda campaign to disguise his upcoming civil war as a foreign war of reconquest. The most important aspect of this propaganda campaign would come from this guy, Marcellinus. Marcellinus was Justinian's aide while he was the heir apparent, and when Justinian rose to the purple, he brought Marcellinus with him, showering him with titles and offices and all that. In return, Marcellinus would give Justinian the gift of a piece of propaganda so powerful that we are still feeling its effects 1500 years later: the Chronicle. The Chronicle, as you've no doubt guessed by now, claims that the Western Roman Empire fell in 476. Here's how Marcellinus describes the event of that year. Odoacer, king of the Goths, took control of Rome. Odoacer slew Orestes right there. Odoacer condemned Augustulus, the son of Orestes, with the penalty of exile in Lucalanum, a fortress in Campania. The Western Empire of the Roman people, which the first emperor Octavian Augustus had begun to rule in the 709th year from the foundation of the city, perished with Augustulus. Pop quiz! Yeah, you thought you were safe. You thought it would never happen here. Oh, this is just some dumb YouTube video. There will never be a pop quiz for this. I could just sit back and relax. Yeah, that's how you sound. Pretty dumb. So, to test that you've been paying attention, what is wrong with this quote? Odoacer wasn't the king of the Goths. He was the head of a Roman and barbarian army, and he was Syrian or something.
She's not that Mexican, Mom. She's my Mexican. And she's Colombian or something.
You know who was a Goth, though? Theodoric. Yeah, that Theodoric. king of the Ostrogoths and the Byzantines' viceroy in Italy, who was having increased tensions with the East. Much in the same way, powerful generals and emperors from all over the empire would have had tensions with each other ever since Sulla and Marius 600 years ago. So, Justinian pulled an Augustus and said, "I'm not invading the Roman Empire, I'm retaking it, because it totally ceased to exist 50 years ago, even though nobody noticed or cared until now." The war that Justinian won the right to fight with Marcellinus's propaganda absolutely ravaged Italy. Following his successful conquest of the Vandals in North Africa, Belisarius moved north to capture Sicily and then landed in Italy in 535. Then, the Romans reconquer most of Italy, and the Ostrogoths take it all back, and then the Romans take it all back, and then boom, the Lombards show up and take most of it for themselves. The whole thing lasts decades. Rome is besieged multiple times, Milan is burnt to the ground, the entire population killed or enslaved, the countryside is ravaged, and it's at this moment, when you're standing alone in the ruins of the depopulated Eternal City, that you might think that the Roman Empire has fallen. But of course, you're standing in it right now. So when then? What point in time did the Roman Empire go from existing to non-existing? Please take the time to type out a long theory in my comment section now. Okay, back to me. To me, suggesting a specific date for the fall of Rome is a little like trying to guess what's inside the briefcase in Pulp Fiction, or whether or not the top stops at the end of Inception. You've missed the point by searching for a precise answer. We shouldn't be asking the question, when did the Roman Empire fall? Because it didn't. It just changed. And we shouldn't be asking, when did it change, either? Because of course the answer is always, since the very beginning. Okay, so at this point, my smart viewer with a critical thinking brain and a skeptical ear, your alarm bells are probably going off. You're thinking, I don't know, Stickman, this kind of sounds like sophistry. The Roman Empire changed rather than fell? If you're going to frame it like that, couldn't you do the same thing for any fallen empire? Well, no, I don't think you could. And to illustrate why, let's return to Scipio Africanus and the smoldering ruins of Carthage. At the beginning, I was rather definitive in my assessment that the Roman Empire shared Carthage's fate. But that was what we like to call in the industry a fake-out, a little misdirection. Haha, you've been bamboozled. The truth is that Carthage is actually the best example of civilizational collapse to juxtapose against that of Rome to prove the profound difference between the two. Difference large enough to justify the different language. So let's go ahead and compare the two. The fall of the Roman Empire saw the invading peoples expropriate between 1/3 and 2/3 of the land. In Carthage, the Romans took everything that they didn't destroy. In Carthage, the invading empire gained military dominance through direct battle and targeted violence. In the Roman Empire, this took place through a slow demographic shift, urged on by Roman leaders trying to alleviate the crisis of military recruitment. It happened more or less voluntarily. In the Roman Empire's case, the invaders desperately tried to establish and maintain a symbolic connection to the traditions and culture of the empire. In Carthage, the Romans defiled and destroyed the culture and traditions of their enemies and wholly replaced them with their own. The Punic Wars saw not just a clash of two civilizations, but also a clash between the gods who allied themselves with each of those societies. In Rome, the religious similarities served as a cultural bridge between the barbarians and the Romans, especially after they converted from Arianism. Rome came to control Carthage's territories through violent struggle and direct force. Barbarians came to control parts of the Roman Empire, yes, through force, but also through the force of Roman law, with the blessing of the Roman head of state. And finally, when the barbarians came into possession of these parts of the empire, rather than entirely replace its institutions with ones of their own, as the Romans had done to Carthage, they adopted them themselves while adapting them to fit their own customs. They synthesized them. This, in my opinion, is the best way to understand late antiquity. Not as the collapse of Rome or the invasion of barbarians, but rather as a synthesis. You got barbarian stuff here in this bubble, Roman stuff here, and as late antiquity developed and these two groups came into increasing contact, the bubbles were smushed together until they became one. Or, to stay on theme here, the Roman ship of Theseus smashed into the barbarian one, and afterwards, emerging from the cartoon smoke cloud was a single, weird amalgamation of both ships. And it was this synthesis that brought us the culture, politics, and economy of post-Roman Europe. Now, I don't want this or anything in this video to be taken as me saying that things didn't change in late antiquity. They certainly did. In fact, things were changing a lot quicker than normal. The Byzantines, Ostrogoths, and Lombards reduced Italy from one of, if not the richest place in the known world, to a destroyed backwater. The Catholic Church burned all the books they didn't like, and there weren't many they liked. The breakdown of central imperial authority over the provinces broke the interconnection in people, goods, and ideas which had characterized the empire for centuries, but it never destroyed the empire itself.
The point of this video is not to argue that the Roman Empire still exists in anything more than a superabundance of cultural, political, and economic influence, but instead to shine a light on the collapse itself, which has been endlessly exaggerated and overstated in popular culture. The Roman Empire changed, it didn't fall, and this happened over the course of centuries and millennia, not on one day when some unimportant puppet emperor was dethroned. This might seem like a trivial distinction, but it isn't. The fall of Rome is a powerful rhetorical trick that's been used to advance the interests of the powerful since there was still a Roman emperor ruling in Italy. Hopefully, now that you've seen my incredibly simplified overview of the process, you'll be prepared for the next time Ronald Reagan tries to use it to rally against welfare, or maybe the next time Joan Collins, star of TV's Dynasty, uses it to attack gay people or volcanoes or something.